All right then, thank you ever so much everybody. I want to welcome you to this Counterfire meeting here today. My name is Kate Connolly. I'm going to be chairing this meeting. We're going to hear first from our two speakers who are going to be talking about the kind of two pressing campaigns that our organisation is most involved with and which seem to us the most important campaigns to make an impact today. So the subject today is how to end war and austerity. We've got two speakers, then we're going to hand over for a discussion, chance for people to make contributions and have a chat about the issue more generally. So first of all, I'm going to introduce James Meadway, who is a senior economist at the New Economics Foundation. And then we're going to hear from Lindsey German, who is the national convener of the Stop the War Coalition, and both of them are leading members of Counterfire. So first of all, I'm going to hand over to James Meadway.
Okay, thank you. Right, so I'm doing the sort of against austerity bit, and Lindsay's going to do the against war bit. So I wanted to start actually with the first point is this, because it's a slightly strange position. To all intents and purposes, the intellectual case for austerity, such as it ever was, has basically completely collapsed in the space of the last 6 months or so. I mean, it was never really there in the first place, just on a kind of technical economics basis. There was no credible economic case for doing austerity. If you thought that austerity was the way to get out of a recession, then this absolutely definitely was not. And Paul Krugman has made, as a liberal Keynesian, not particularly left-wing Keynesian, but a Keynesian economist, a follower more or less of the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, has made this case repeatedly. It's a case you can find in any economics textbook. It basically says that if you're in a recession, the driver of that recession, roughly, is everybody stops spending money. And the problem if everybody stops spending money, if you take the whole economy, is that if they're not spending, it means other people aren't earning money. So everybody cuts their spending, other people earn less, you get a recession. If the government then turns up and also cuts its spending, predictably this makes a recession worse, and that's exactly what's happened for the last few years in this country, not quite as spectacularly as somewhere like Greece, which is catastrophic, or Southern Europe more generally, but essentially this kind of long, drawn-out, prolonged recession that we have has been certainly extended by the imposition of austerity, and very, very dramatic spending cuts by this government. I mean, essentially the worst in this country since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And just to give you a sense of the scale of this, of course, we're only about 20% of the way through the planned schedule of cuts. So if the thing rumbles on, there is plenty more still to come. So the intellectual case was never really there in the first place, and I think it's essentially disintegrated still further over the course of this year. And people might remember the fuss about a paper by two very eminent academic economists in the US, Rogoff and Reinhardt, two surnames, and they'd purported to demonstrate that if a country has too much debt relative to the size of its economy, too much public debt, national debt, growth collapses and everything's a disaster. And this was used by George Osborne, amongst others, as proving the case for austerity. We have too much debt, the government here has too much debt, therefore we have to cut spending, because otherwise we hit what they describe as this 90% debt to the size of the economy barrier, after which growth collapses. Anyway, it turns out there's a graduate student up in Massachusetts who basically sat down and tried to reproduce their results. They said it was a big study of the last 50, 60 years experience right away across the entire world that demonstrates conclusively that very high debt to GDP ratio is definitely bad for the economy. He tried reproducing their results, couldn't do it, and realised that essentially they'd added up a few sums wrong in their Excel spreadsheet, and this has skewed the entire result. And once that had been demonstrated, to the embarrassment of certainly the two authors, there was no credible case there at all. There was no sort of intellectual economics case for austerity whatsoever. So that's one unusual part of it. The other unusual part of what's taking place, I suppose, is if you look at what Osborne said in his speech at conference. I mean, it's the first time really since he's been Chancellor. He was starting to sound a bit bullish about things. He was starting to sound, a bit more confident. He's laying out the stall and trying to tell a kind of story that the Conservatives want to sell to us for the next 18 months in the run-up to the election. which is basically the, you know, we stuck the course, we did austerity, and now the recovery is starting to happen. And he was quoting 1.4 million private sector jobs created in this country. Mortgages are going to carry on being low. We're going to throw in additional support for those seeking to buy a house through Help to Buy. We're going to reintroduce 95% mortgages and this sort of thing. That's where you should really pause for consideration, because if he's talking about a recovery and if he's trying to pretend it's a result of austerity, and rest assured it's nothing to do with that, then this bit about where this recovery is coming from suddenly looks quite important. Because if you look at how most people are still living and how they've been affected by the crash of 2008 and the recession afterwards, it's not a particularly pretty picture. You know, real earnings have fallen by about 9% since the crash of 2008. Under this government, they've fallen about 5.5%. That's the biggest decline in living standards, certainly since the Great Depression. It's comparable to what took place in this country in the Great Depression, arguably a bit worse. So it's a huge attack on how most people live. Average earnings are falling and falling and falling. That's one part of this, you know, supposed recovery. The other bit of it is that if you look at these 1.4 million private sector jobs that have been created, according to George Osborne, I mean, the first thing to do is, of course, you have to take away from 1.4 million new jobs the 500,000 plus that they've destroyed in the public sector. So your total comes to about 700,000 jobs created. Of those 700,000 jobs created, 4 out of 5 on the TUC's figures are low paid, and low paid means that they're earning less than 60% of average earnings. So in other words, lots of jobs sort of have been created, not enough to chew away all the unemployment that's been created since the recession broke out, but those jobs that are being created are low paid in general. 4 out of 5 of them are low paid. 1 out of 5 then isn't, but of those 4 out of 5 that are low paid, as you'll have seen from the developing, and quite rightly developing fuss about zero-hour contracts, about underemployment, these are insecure, low-paid jobs, mostly in the service sector, and interestingly concentrated essentially in London and the South East. If you take the whole spread of where jobs have been created since 2007, actually, these figures, then you've got in London 287,000 jobs have been created on balance. In the rest of the country, 276,000 have been lost. So you've got this economy, you've got this recovery in Osborne's story that's producing, at best, lots and lots of low-paid jobs that are mostly in the southeast, that are mostly insecure, and that most people in work are still seeing real declines in living standards. Now, you know, in what sense is this a recovery that's worth talking about? The only bits that they can cling to, and the bit that they're going to increasingly cling to, and the reason he's so keen to talk about interest rates being low and support for mortgages, is the news just over the last few weeks. New sets of figures out for what's happened to house prices, which is, of course, in London, it's another house price boom. House prices have risen 10% over the last year. And just in London, the rest of the country have only risen 0.8%. So you've got developing here at least what looks suspiciously like, and if people saw the Financial Times yesterday, Lloyd's banker saying is very definitely suspiciously like another housing bubble. The real wages aren't moving, the jobs being created are mostly low paid, but what Osborne, via a combination of low interest rates, quantitative easing, and direct government support for mortgages now, is stoking up is another housing bubble. And it becomes very apparent that what's really going on here is that their initial plan, let's do austerity and kind of hope for the best, it's not much of a plan, but they were going to stick to it, has failed. And they're doing what successive governments have done here for the last 30 odd years, which is stoke up another housing bubble. We had a very, very long version of this under New Labour. Brown thought it was no return to boom and bust. The thing busts spectacularly in 2008. What we've got under Osborne is a repetition of precisely that. So it's not the case that austerity is working. It's not the case that Osborne's initial plan was working. Given the failure of that plan, what they seem to be doing quite deliberately now is stoking up another house price bubble, which might be nice if you own a house, but bear in mind, of course, the average age of a first-time buyer in London is now 37 years old. The Centre for Economic and Business Research has done, and it's quite a simple projection, but it's saying that, 5 years' time, the average London house price will be £550,000. That this is all well and good if you own a house, and it might have some impact on the rest of the economy. In that you own a house that's rising in value, you feel richer, you go out and spend, you go out and borrow. Consumer borrowing is starting to rise again, But it doesn't really translate very well if you don't own a house, and it doesn't really translate, it turns out, into increases in real living standards for most people. Whilst all this is going on, of course, recorded profits for certainly large companies are continuing to rise. What are they doing with their profits? Well, they're sitting on them. Cash balances, money just held by large corporations in this country, estimates vary a bit, but you're talking anything from £300 billion to £700 billion that they're basically sitting on. This is profits that are being sat on and not invested. If they're not invested, you don't get jobs out the other side. That's the kind of mechanism that we're going through here. So that's the kind of failure of austerity. That's what we're getting instead of the failure of austerity is an attempt to stoke up another housing bubble. My guess is that Osborne and colleagues are hoping that this bubble will get them till, let's say, to pick a random date, some point around May 2015, and then perhaps at that point we'll all kind of decide that we feel rich again and vote Conservative. That's the fairly crude, I think, political calculation that's taking place here. But if you're speaking in politics, what's really unusual about this is that the intellectual case for austerity never existed. It was never there in the first place. It's disintegrated this year. The actual evidence that we've had in this economy and elsewhere that has done austerity for the last 3-4 years now, 5 years since the crash, is that it doesn't work. And yet you find that across the main parties there is essentially a complete consensus on the need for austerity. There's no intellectual case for it. The actual experience of most people is that this thing doesn't work. The only way you can now get the economy to look like it's moving is start to stoke up another house price bubble, and yet you find a consensus on it. You find that, for example, the Shadow Chancellor, Ed Balls, is completely nailed to doing austerity. He's committed to this sort of thing. That Labour still says that if it wins the next election, it wants to stick to Conservative spending plans. Osborne, of course, has stretched the goalposts on this one. He's saying that by 2020, if the Tories get elected, they want an actual surplus on government spending. So they want to be getting more in taxes than they're spending by 2020. The very substantial implication of this is worsening austerity for the rest of this decade and frankly beyond. But Labour signed up to this. Now some of this of course reflects a direct kind of personal political problem, I think, for Ed Balls, especially in that, in the case of Ed Balls, that he's wedded to austerity because of his own political history, because he was the person in the past who was Gordon Brown's chief advisor on these things. He was one of the architects of how New Labour, way back in the early 1990s, thought it was going to run the economy. He was one of the people who talked up the possibility of doing this kind of deal with the devil that New Labour actually did, which was allow the City of London, the financial system, off the leash, deregulate over here, and then skim a little bit in taxes off the top of this, which looked quite reasonable for about maybe 8-9 years or so, and then crashed spectacularly in 2008. And of course the consequences of that crash we're now having to live with. It's wiped out whatever gains you might have got in taxes from the city over that period of time. It was always a deal with the devil. So I think in the case of Ed Balls, he's wedded to it because of his own political history. And you can carry on like that. You can carry on like that through the rest of the British political class. That none of them are capable at this point in time of breaking with the drive to austerity because of the way the political economy of austerity plays out. Because it's kind of bad for most of us. It's bad for the economy in general. But if you do austerity, what you're privileging above anything else is saying that we don't care. If you're doing it because you want to repay your debts and close a deficit and all the other stuff that the government comes out with, what you're saying is we don't care how much damage this inflicts on the real economy. We don't care if it drags growth backwards, pushes unemployment up. We don't care about the direct social consequences, which we're all, I think by now, very familiar with. What happens when you start to cut spending in this way? It is the most vulnerable who get directly affected. We don't care about any of that. What we care about is making sure that people who hold financial assets, in particular government debt, are definitely paid off. You privilege that above everything else. You make sure that your financial system is insulated and you can let the rest of the economy go hang. And that's how the political economy of this thing starts to play out. And that's why you don't find at this point in time any of the main political parties prepared to turn around and say they'll do anything about it. Because if you're going to break with austerity, if you're going to break with what now looks like quite a long-term plan to essentially reshape both the British state, to shrink it, relative to the rest of the economy, to change all of our relationships with it, and to change therefore also how the rest of the economy operates. They won't break with that because they're not capable of doing the very difficult task of also breaking with the way that British capitalism has been structured around financial capital as its leading part for at least the last 30 years, and actually essentially stretching somewhat back before that point. They're all tied into this. So that's, I hope, not a counsel of despair, because I think there's a couple of things that we can do about this one. The first one is that they may all be tied into it, but this is actually quite a brittle coalition. The coalition itself is quite a brittle, effectively fairly weak group. You know, neither the Tories nor the Lib Dems really want to be in this thing. The Tories very definitely do not. The Lib Dems probably see it as their only chance of getting into office, but they're not desperately pleased with it. Neither of them really want to be there. They've agreed on austerity. It's the only thing holding the whole shebang together, but nonetheless you can see that pressure applied to them starts to have some impact. The bedroom tax, about which there has been a very good, effective campaign, not least of which was naming what I think the Tories wanted to call the spare room subsidy removal as the bedroom tax. Yeah, that's an important part of winning these things. Naming it as a bedroom tax, applying effective political pressure, gets a commitment from Labour to remove the bedroom tax if they're elected. And now, just earlier today, the announcement by Nick Clegg of an independent review into its impact. They don't need an independent review to see its impact, because there are very, very many people who tell you loud and clear what its impact has been. But this is the first steps towards getting a reversal in the policy, because of course the independent review can say, oh dear, we underestimated the impact of all this and therefore we'll have to do something about it. This is where pressure starts to make a difference. You can see again, I think, Ed Miliband's wobbled around all over the place, but he's taken a real move to the left in a way we haven't seen, and this is, you know, how feeble the Labour Party has been for a good number of years, but in a way that we haven't seen certainly for most of my adult life. A Labour leader who makes a pitch to the left and says that we will increase corporation tax for large businesses, we will freeze energy prices for 2 years, we will do a list of basically fairly populist measures precisely designed to appeal to a left that exists out there in terms of public opinion, and that potentially is starting to get organised. And it's that organisation that is decisive here, and decisive, I think, for the next 18 months, at least until the election. You see, I think the People's Assembly has, for the first time since the coalition government was created and made it very clear it was going to impose austerity, for the first time has started to draw together the different strands of opposition to that government around a common belief in the need for an end to austerity and some sort of alternative somewhat to be decided at this point in time. But let's get to the first step. We're opposed to austerity. We have a launch in June which 4,500 odd people turned up to in London. There have been any number of people's assemblies right the way across the country which have been the biggest political meetings in places like Newcastle and Manchester for years, around the simple idea that a mass movement can apply pressure not just to this government but also, I think, critically to every other part of the political class, to the Labour Party, and start to force the question of austerity away from this is the only option we have. The intellectual case isn't there. The empirical evidence, the experience of the last few years certainly demonstrates isn't there. But until we start to pull together the political organisation around something that looks like a mass movement, that draws on all the different strands of opposition to austerity, we're not simply going to be able to shove them out of the way. So I think the People's Assembly remains central to what anybody in Counterfire should be building at this point in time. Really, it should be central to what anybody on the left is doing at this point in time if you're going to pick the key issues facing the working class today, and the issues that are having the most impact on people. It's precisely on the question of austerity. So I'm going to finish on that and hand over to Lindsey at this point, who's going to talk about opposing the war.
Okay, sorry. Okay, well, I'm not sure how much I'm going to talk about opposing war actually, but I'll kind of start with it. But I wanted to say some other things as well. I mean, James has given a very good outline, I think, of the whole way in which the government is trying to enforce what is a completely barbaric reshaping of society, which will result in a worsening of conditions for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. We're already seeing this with people at the sharp end being attacked over benefits. We know that what is happening to the NHS is a systematic attempt to privatise it. We know that already, before the post office workers even had the chance to strike, they sold off the shares for Royal Mail at ridiculously low price, which almost instantly went up by a third after the sell-off. We know they're doing worse things. We know that generally they talk about the hard-working families and all this other kind of stuff, but actually it's precisely the so-called hard-working families who are the people they are really screwing day to day over their lives. If you look at the amount of hours worked in each family compared to, say, 30 or 40 years ago, it is getting on for double in terms of wage work that people do. I'm not talking about work unpaid inside the home, because you have both the man working and the woman working, usually full-time, and you also have children, students, all these other people who used to get free grants and all that sort of thing are also having to engage in paid employment. So there has been a huge increase in the number of people who have to go out and work for a wage and who are then exploited by the system. There has been a huge increase in the amount of money that people pay for things that you used to take for granted would be free. So your pension, people have to pay far more. They have to pay for their education at higher education level, and people have these debts. And of course, James has talked about the housing bubble. I mean, speaking as somebody who's a privileged Hackney homeowner, which I noticed in The Guardian today is the epicentre of the housing bubble, it doesn't mean anything to anybody that you own a house or a flat which is worth, I mean, in the case of Hackney, many of the houses are now worth £1 million. I mean, you know, these are things which were Jerry built 150 years ago. It's completely crazy. But it doesn't mean anything because your children can't afford to buy anywhere. People are paying astronomical rents. The only way you will realise this is by selling your flat and moving to somewhere else in the country where you can't get a job. So it's absolutely meaningless, apart from the speculators and the private landlords and all these sorts of people. Incidentally, the private landlords are being subsidised by tax subsidies to be able to buy-to-let mortgages are subsidised by the taxpayer, by you and me. That's exactly how fair this kind of society is. So I wanted to talk about all of these different things, but I will say a little bit about war and the consequences of war. We have lived with wars in this country now for 12 years. The consequence has been a complete degradation of many, many different societies. We've seen it in Afghanistan, we've seen it in Iraq, and we've seen it in Libya and now in Syria. The completely terrible humanitarian crises paid for, created by the Western governments. And we are paying for those crises as well. We're paying millions of pounds a day to sustain the wars. We're paying millions of pounds a day to sustain Trident and other nuclear weapons. We're doing all these sorts of things. And in the meantime, what the consequence has been is a society which is much, much worse than it was before these wars. Take the question of terrorism. There's been another arrest, I don't know the truth or otherwise of it. You can't really make head nor tail from the Evening Standard, but so who knows what, you know, this is a police press statement, it's nothing more, so we don't know what the situation is. But there is no doubt that if you look in 2001, Al-Qaeda, Islamic terrorism, however you want to define it, was confined pretty much to Afghanistan and Pakistan. You now have a situation, if you look at the map, it goes right across the Middle East, across very wide parts of Africa now. If you look in Mali, in Somalia, in Kenya, in all these places, and every time it happens, you know, in Al-Shabaab attack a shopping centre in Nairobi, why on earth are they doing this? Well, they're doing it because of the wars that have been going on for decades now. They're doing it because of the grievances that they have. They're doing it because they don't like the Western governments and they think this is the only way they can get back at them. So the consequence is we live in a much more unstable and dangerous world. We also live in a world which is much more racist than it was 10 or 15 years ago, and it was a pretty racist world then. But if you look at one of the things that the wars have done is to create a rise in Islamophobia on the one hand, so that we have more and more, particularly in continental Europe, where there are countries which pass laws about not wearing the hijab in work or in school, as in France, stop prohibiting the building of mosques, the the ban on the burqa, which they tried to raise as an issue in the British Parliament a few weeks ago. You know, the idea that somehow, you know, we can't see somebody's face and this is a terrible, you know, attack on our freedoms and all this kind of stuff, which is exacerbated by the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, and all these other papers. You look at actually what is happening is a big rise in racism against Muslims, but there's also something else which is happening, which is a big rise in attacks on immigrants and refugees. And the fact that the Prime Minister of Malta can say that the Mediterranean Sea has now become a cemetery, because every week now people are dying as a result of their desperation of trying to get in boats to get to a particular island, usually Malta or Lampedusa, which are part of the European Union and therefore will perhaps enable them to get to some miserable life somewhere in Germany or Britain or anywhere else. What an indictment of our system that these people, by and large, nearly all of them, by the way, are refugees from war. They're countries like Eritrea and Somalia who are desperately trying to get somewhere else. We say we intervene in these wars for humanitarian reasons, but when there are real humanitarian tragedies, nobody wants to know and nobody's interested. I noticed the Italian government gave them all citizenship when they were dead, but they won't give citizenship to people when they're alive who want to come and live in their country. In fact, they have a black government minister who is greeted in the most foul way, you know, monkey noises and bananas and all the sorts of things that frankly should have gone out decades and decades ago. So these are real issues that we're facing in terms of the kind of world that we live in, and the kind of world which has always had this economic brutality but is now developing, if you like, a political and social brutality which is encouraged by our government and the governments across Europe and wider in the world. I mean, if you look at inequality is growing in practically every country in the world. Now, the question, I think, for us tonight is what can we do about it? Because there is no question that the nature of economic crisis breeds all sorts of things which we're unfortunately getting all too familiar with. The growth of the attacks on immigrants, the growth of the attacks on people on benefits, of people who are disabled or sick, who are, you know, regularly now pilloried as scroungers in most of the media. And of course we do see the growth of the far right. I mean, if you look in Greece, there is a very, very serious crisis over the growth of Golden. But also, I don't know if people saw the situation in Russia, where there have been where they've arrested a load of migrant workers to stop them being attacked. No doubt the police in Russia don't really care what happens to them. They've arrested a load of them because Russian nationalist right-wingers have been rioting because one Russian was killed by a migrant worker. This is what's going on in Russia. I mean, so this is a very, very dangerous situation. But it isn't the only situation, because also out of these wars and austerity, people do resist. And what we're also seeing in all these countries is a growing number of people who say, if this is what the system is, then I don't want it, and I want an alternative, and I want something which isn't just about we go and elect somebody who looks slightly nicer for the next 5 years, although according to Nick Clegg it's got to include him. I mean, he seems to think that, you know, whatever government gets elected, Nick Clegg has to be in it. But I think people are more and more thinking, we don't just want this, we don't just want a Tory or a Labour government which is exactly the same, we don't just want the austerity programmes, we don't want the attacks on benefits, we don't want these things, and people are beginning to resist, and most importantly they're resisting over their own living standards, because in countries like Portugal and Greece this has been driven down very, very substantially, but even in Britain people now are seriously worse off than they were 5 or 6 years ago, which is why you do get, I mean, for example, in the colleges there's going to be a strike, I think by the end of this month, because of the overpay, because of the situation where wages have been held down, in real terms have fallen. So all those things are going on, and it seems to me that we should encourage this resistance, and we should say a number of things. Firstly, that protest works. James referred to the bedroom tax. There is no doubt in my mind they would not be talking about an independent inquiry to the bedroom tax if it wasn't for the fact that people have demonstrated up and down the country, and of course the thing isn't workable, And apparently, I was reading today, the Tories seriously believe that people would just pay it and carry on living in their same houses, because of course it isn't workable at all. Little realising that most people don't have the spare ISA that they can cash in, or other means of finding the money to pay for their rent, and therefore they're too poor to do anything but move out. That has become, the bedroom tax has become a major problem for the government, because people affected by it have resisted it, and other people have resisted it as well. And as James said, the fact that it's been called the bedroom tax, which they really hate, the Tories, so he's trying to stop it being called that, tells you exactly what effect that had. From my point of view, what happened in August with the vote in Parliament over Syria was a fundamental change in terms of British politics in relation to imperialism and war. That they wanted to go to war on Syria. In fact, David Cameron brought all the MPs back from their lengthy holiday, when they were going to be back the following Monday anyway, at vast expense, again, to all us poor hard-working people who pay taxes in this country, in order to get them to ram through a vote so they could go and have a cruise missile attack on Syria that weekend, the last weekend in August. That was the aim of the operation. Now, the truth is, he lost that vote by 13 votes. So it's a very narrow loss, but it was incredibly important, because what it meant was all the arguments we had 10 years ago about Iraq, all the things we said, it didn't work then. Blair was able to get that through, but actually we won the argument. And we won the argument because what we said was true and what they said was a lie. And this time, even the craven and miserable members of the Houses of Parliament, who usually don't even think about how they're going to vote, felt too much, they felt they couldn't do what they did over Iraq again. And they also knew the strength of public opinion and the strength of the anti-war movement over this issue. So that was a big victory. If it then affected Obama, who was going to have the airstrike that weekend and was forced to say he had to go to Congress, he couldn't get the vote through Congress, and suddenly, lo and behold, suddenly we've got a peace process on our hands, which is what they could have done in the first place. I mean, they say there's no diplomatic solution. The reason there's never been a diplomatic solution in Syria is because the Americans have always blocked it. The Americans have always said, we won't sit down with Assad, we won't sit down with anybody from the government. Now, whatever you think of Assad, that was a completely unrealistic thing to do. Virtually every war ends in negotiation. And the truth of the matter is that the Syrian war will end in negotiation. The Afghan war is ending in negotiation. That's why the Taliban are sitting around talking to the Americans. And it's absolute hypocrisy to say anything else. So all of that, I think we stopped what would now be a very, very major war in the Middle East, with all the consequences for it. So I think firstly for us protest works. Secondly, we need to organise to make sure we can resist these people. Historically, that has meant the Labour Party. That's what people did 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, when they formed the Labour Party, and they did so because they had very, very big strikes and very, very big protests and a whole number of political issues that came up, and they wanted, particularly the trade unions, wanted some representation in Parliament, and they believed that as more and more people got the vote, and crucially as women got the vote, although they all thought they'd vote Tory, lots of people thought women would always vote Tory, but actually of course now it's the other way round. Women are much more left-wing if you look at voting intentions than men are, but actually they believed that once they got majorities in Parliament they could bring in a socialist, just, equal world. We know that has never happened, and we know that even when Miliband, I think, made a decision at the Labour Party conference that he was going to put some distance between himself and the Tories, and he did so with the threat to freeze the energy prices for 20 months, which isn't the greatest threat in the world, but it was enough to send the energy companies completely bonkers, because they thought it was a terrible infringement of their liberties to charge as much money to old people and everybody else that they possibly could. So, we then had the Daily Mail saying he's a communist and his father hated Britain and all the other, and Jewish and all the other things that that the Daily Mail really loves to hate, So we had all that sort of stuff. But actually, what Miliband found was the vote on Syria, the standing up to the energy companies. Guess what? They're popular. They're popular because the majority of people in this country are to the left of the main consensus parties over a whole number of issues. Not over everything. They're not over immigration. I'm not sure they're to the right of them anymore these days, but over many social issues, they are to the left of Labour. So you've got a situation, I think, now where Miliband will be saying the alternative to 5 more years of Cameron is Labour, and that's an argument that most people, whether they accept or not, the truth is that the election in 2015 is going to be between Labour and the Tories. That's a fact. You know, there's no other party that's going to come anywhere close to forming a government. But that leaves a very big question as well, which is, if Labour is going to pursue at least some of these things, the free schools and all the other things that they're talking about, how do we actually begin to create a mass opposition to these things? Well, I'll just put forward a couple of things. Have you given me 2 minutes? You probably have. Sorry, Kate. That's right. You'd have to nudge me or something. Or so just very quickly on these. If we want to do it, how do we do it? To me, the most important thing is that socialists have to be relevant to people outside their small circles. There is absolutely no point in all of us in this room coming to total agreement about absolutely everything, you know, the need for, I don't know, as the utopian socialists said, free lemonade or any of these things. We can agree on absolutely everything in this room, but unless we can be relevant to the people who are concerned about the bedroom tax, who are concerned about the war, who are concerned about all these issues, then we might as well just stay in this room. So it's a question of how do groups of socialists organise themselves, but how do they do so in order to organise much wider numbers of people? And that's what the People's Assembly is about. It's what Stop the War has been about. It's all those things. And you know, we've got a whole number of things going on in this country. There's going to be a big teacher strike in London and the east of England on Thursday, and they say, and certainly one that happened a couple of weeks ago, people say much more militant than a couple of years ago. I'm sure that will be true about the colleges. It's true with the firefighters. There's a level of industrial struggle which is still absolutely abominably low in this country because of all the attacks on working class people and on the unions that we've had over the last 30 years. But the strikes are very significant, and they are going to happen, and they are going to be important, and some of them will win some concessions. And so that is a very important thing for us. But the strikes on their own are not enough because the people in the unions are suffering the lack of confidence and all these things. So it's a question of the People's Assembly, of socialists, of all sorts of groups of people saying these issues are connected. The war and your wages and what's happening to your pensions and all these different things are part of the same attack, and they have to be defeated in that kind of way. And so that, it seems to me, is the immediate perspective for us. I also think we have to think about building socialist organisations, building Counterfire, building all the because in the end of the day we have to also look at a transformation of society. That's a much bigger question, and it's a question that we're a small organisation and we're not in a position to simply bring that about as and when we want to bring it about, otherwise it would have happened a long time ago. But it's also true that when people face these kind of crises, when people have big things happening in their lives, when there are big attacks on their living standards, sometimes people don't fight, but they begin to think, what can this system deliver? This system can deliver less and less for working people who want a future of, well, most people don't want very much in their future apart from a decent life for themselves and for their children and families and friends. But even to deliver this is becoming increasingly hard, and I think that means that more and more people will be looking for an alternative, and we have to try to provide it.
Thank you very much, James and Lindsay. I'm now going to hand over for questions, comments and discussions. So if you'd like to speak, please just indicate to me and I'll call people in turn. And then Lindsay and James will can answer some of those questions. So obviously this has been a meeting organised by Counterfire. So if you've liked this, we've got 2 activist meetings coming up in London, one in North London and one in South London. They're both going to be on Tuesday at 6 o'clock. So the one in South London is going to meet at Waterloo Action Centre, which is in the Cut. And the one in North London is going to meet at the Finsbury Park Trust, which is number 225, Seven Sisters Road. We've also this Sunday got a meeting for members and supporters of Counterfire. That's going to be from 11 to 4 p.m. In room G3 at SOAS. So it'd be lovely to see you there if you want to make that. Also, because this is our cafe here, Firebox, and obviously we've been using the space today for our meeting here. You know, it's something that obviously couldn't be used by anybody else at the time. So to sort of help us towards the cost of that, we are going to, hopefully somebody has got a plastic cup that could be handed around, and a little bucket. So if you could just give very generously to that, that would be very much appreciated. So I'm going to, who wants to come back first?
That's not mine. What do you want? I'll try to go first.
Okay, so first of all, Lindsay and then James.
Okay, well, thanks very much for all the for the contributions. I thought it was really interesting. I think there's loads and loads of things that have come out of it. I just want to talk about a few, and hopefully James will deal with all the others. So firstly, the question right at the beginning about inequality growing and people being condemned to poverty. I think this is absolutely the case, and there is a very direct relationship between the decline of the trade unions and the growth of inequality. You can see it, you know, the graphs are exactly the same. And actually, if you look, the British trade unions began to grow on a sort of upward scale during the Second World War, where the government needed the unions and brought them effectively into government and everything. And that went up effectively till the late 60s, early 70s, a very militant movement then, partly because that was the first time they began to try to control the unions and pass laws to control them. And actually, Thatcherism, if you like, I mean, she succeeded, but it was a tribute to the trade unions that they needed Thatcherism to actually defeat the British trade unions. And ever since then, you've seen all the things we've been talking about: the privatisation, the inequality, the growth of wages falling, and all this kind of thing. So I think it's very, very important, and it's very connected. The questions about the media, I think the media is incredibly important, and obviously we know it is controlled by a small number of people. They are, for the most part, complete dictators. You know, if you think of Paul Dacre, Rupert Murdoch, all these people, they're absolute dictators who want to tell everybody what to think and do. Who've got absolutely, who say they speak for ordinary people, because they've got absolutely no clue how most ordinary people think or live or anything else. The only thing I would say about the media, it is very important, but of course people's real consciousness develops in a different way from just reading the media. I mean, there was a letter in the Guardian actually from a professor of media studies who was saying that actually something like a quarter of people who read the Daily Mail don't vote Tory. So they read the Daily Mail because they like the features, or they like, I don't know, what, the sport or whatever. People read it for what?
The horoscope.
The horoscope, okay. James is a Daily Mail reader of the horoscope. But people read it for all sorts of different reasons, which isn't good, because there's a lot of kind of insidious ideas, especially in those horoscopes. But actually it's not the same as them accepting all the beliefs. And when you actually look at it, you find that people are told all these things about, scroungers and all this sort of thing, but actually they only believe, either they don't believe any of it, or they only believe part of it. So I think the media is only as strong as when people don't start resisting and don't start organising. I think that's an important lesson for us. Now, the points that people made about alternatives to Labour, I mean, you see, I think what Miliband is doing is really, on the one hand, saying we need to position ourselves so there is enough different about Labour to enable people to go out and vote for it and all this kind of thing. At the same time, it's absolutely clear from the statements this week have been an absolute disgrace, as people have said, over benefits, over the free schools, over all that. I mean, this is a week when a woman was sacked from being the head of a free school in Pimlico who had absolutely no qualifications to do anything in education. It's quite incredible sort of thing. And when she was attacked some months ago by a Labour councillor in Westminster, they were told that he was just vindictive, and why didn't he want somebody who had no qualifications, no experience or anything else to head this primary school. So I think there's, obviously I think Labour is very much on a tightrope. They've got Miliband moved against the Blairites and demoted them from the shadow cabinet, which was quite a significant thing. He stood up to the Daily Mail, which won't do him any harm in most circles. But at the same time, I think we can expect, as the election gets closer, the natural tendency of Labour will be to look at the, steady as she goes, look at the opinion polls, don't do anything that upsets the opinion polls, and particularly over things like immigration and benefits and all the things that we know are popular tabloid attacks. They are appalling. That is the simple truth of it. Now, I still think there will be a Labour government. I mean, it's 18 months away, so you don't know. I mean, it's possible that the point at the back that you can have a Lib Dem Labour government, which is definitely what the Blairites want. That's what Tony Blair wanted actually in 1997, but his landslide was so big that he couldn't do it. But that's what he was planning. He was talking to Paddy Ashdown and everybody. And they definitely want that again, the right wing of Labour, if they can get it, because they know that gives them a cast iron excuse for never doing anything decent and progressive, and they'll do it. So that's a possibility, obviously, but if Labour, the way the electoral system works, Labour would be unlucky to only get a minority government, the way things are stacking up. In that situation, I think it's hard for them to go with the Lib Dems, particularly because they are going to get a very bad result, I would have thought, in 2015. Tories and UKIP, I don't see it myself, but maybe I'm wrong. I mean, they haven't got a single MP. We hear a lot about UKIP, but actually they don't have a single MP. And the Tories didn't win the last election, so I don't see how they're going to get anywhere really just with UKIP. They'll have to go with the Lib Dems again is the only possibility for them, and I don't think that's likely to happen. So anyway, whatever happens, the crucial thing, people have made the point, is what really matters is how we go into the election. Is there a rising tide of confidence among working class people? Is there a rising tide of struggle? Have we succeeded in beating off even quite small attacks? Because, as people said, the one over the war, it's a vote in Parliament. It's not a revolution, but actually it does make a lot of people realise, well, this is something that's happened and we've achieved this, and then they begin to think, can they achieve other things? So I think that's important. The question about so I think what a Labour government would mean for the movement, Labour is always absolutely bloody awful about these things, but it is forced in certain circumstances to have to accept some of the movement's demands, to have to accept what people want to do, and all these other questions. Alternatives to Labour, there are lots of people want an alternative to Labour. I want an alternative to Labour. I think it's absolutely, we've had it for 100 years, it hasn't worked, it's not going to work. I think that's fairly clear. It's preferable to the Tories, but as a vehicle for fundamental change in society, it's never, in my opinion, going to happen. The problem I think we've got, I was involved with Respect in its kind of good time, and we did very, very well. We did better than any other electoral alternative ever has since the Second World War. And I got 20% when I stood in Newham, which was second. It might not sound a lot, but in Newham, believe me, nobody else gets anything apart from Labour. So it was good. And we had big swings towards us because of the impact of the war. But the problem is, there's all sorts of reasons why that didn't succeed. But it seems to me, Respect had the possibility of succeeding because it came out of a mass movement, in that case against the war. The problem is, there hasn't been sufficient of a mass movement yet. People's Assembly is doing its best. The various campaigns around the bedroom tax are doing their best. We still don't have such a huge mass movement that can break. And I believe one of the reasons Respect didn't succeed, you didn't have several Labour MPs breaking, you didn't have trade union leaders breaking from Labour, you didn't have all those kind of things. And you need that if you're going to have a serious one. Now, Left Unity, which, I respect a whole number of people involved in it, not everybody, but I do respect, quite a number of the people who are involved in it. But anyway, that's my view. But I think it's misplaced at the moment, to tell the truth, because I think 18 months before an election, you can see even a little shove of Miliband to the left begins to get people saying maybe we should go back to Labour. Maybe I've had people saying to me, I'm going to rejoin Labour, I left over the war, but I'm going to go back. Now, that isn't on a massive scale, but it does mean the space closes for an electoral alternative this side of the election. The other side of the election is anybody's guess. It's anybody's guess. It depends how Labour behaves. It depends how much they fall out with the trade union leaders. They really annoyed the Unite leaders over the stuff about funding. They've kind of made it up for the time being, but that probably won't last. And, therefore, who knows? It's anybody's guess. And in principle, I think it has to be done, but I don't actually think at the present this is going to be the means to do so. What does that mean for us? Because we disagree over this question with Left Unity, doesn't mean we don't work with them. We do work with them over all the campaigns we've talked about, and we should do. I believe that the left should work together over specific campaigns. It would be nice if we could all agree about everything to do with the party. But frankly, the state of the British left at the moment is exactly the opposite of that. That's the truth. It's absolutely fragmented and divided and needs to sort itself out. And the only way that's going to happen is through building a mass movement, and then you clarify some of the ideas politically. Anyway, that's my take on it. What, have I covered everything? Have I got to shut up?
No.
Okay.
But I think.
All right, just quickly. The demo's being cracked down. What's happening to demos is very serious, right? Because there's more and more attempts to attack them. But again, this has always been the case. If you want to demonstrate, you have to fight and assert your right to demonstrate. This is true. Even when we had the 2 million strong march, they tried to stop us going to Hyde Park because they said we'd damaged the grass. And we said, well, we're going to go, whatever happens. And surprise, surprise, you get taken to one of these secret meetings where they go off and say, well, come back in 15 minutes. And they go off and phone the government minister or whoever they go and phone. And they suddenly say, oh, it's all right, you can march where you want to march. And that's what we have to do. We have to assert people's right to protest, we have to oppose the laws, all those kind of things. And that just brings me to the final point, which is the power of protest, the point that a number of people have made. It's absolutely central. If we don't protest, if we don't demonstrate, if we don't stand up and say no, then nobody will ever know that there is opposition, and therefore it's our job and the people around us to always stand up and say no when we think that an injustice has been committed. So anyway, sorry, I went on to do that.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'm now going to hand over to James.
Try to deal with what's left. Okay, the issue of tax avoidance, because particularly since UK Uncut have turned what would otherwise be a very dry issue of accountancy and not much else into something that people have grasped, it looks like a bit of a no-brainer. I mean, even on the revenue and customs, very, very low and deliberately low estimates of tax avoidance, £25 billion a year that's just sort of disappearing through various fiddles and loopholes. Bigger estimates get up to £120 billion a year you could get pretty easily. Just employ some more tax inspectors, be a bit firmer about closing some of these loopholes, change a little bit of legislation, you're there. You've got £120 billion. So why on earth isn't this being done? Because this, I mean, most of us don't do any of these things. This is something you do if you're, never mind the top 1%, the top 0.1%. That's where you're getting away with this stuff. It's big corporations, nothing to do with the rest of us. It costs us nothing to do this. So why is no political party talking seriously about this? And I think this gets you into the basic problem is that we don't live in an economy that's structured around what we would like and what we want to see happen. That's not how things work here. In particular, if you're talking about British capitalism in particular, it is very heavily skewed towards doing what financial services and the financial industry wants. And you can see this very crudely. 1/3 of the top 1% are employed in financial services. 3% of the rest of the workforce are in financial services, 1/3 of the top 1%. It's a very crude measure of just how important this is to very rich people. And that's why you don't get a serious effort being made on clamping down tax avoidance. Because what is the City of London? It's an enormous great tax haven. It is Britain that runs the major tax havens, and we do it because it means you can run a very large financial system. Why is it that you get scandal after scandal appearing in London involving Swiss banks or American banks, UBS being the most recent one, LIBOR rigging? It's all happening in London because in the City of London, in the financial service industry in Britain, it's not regulated, it's not taxed, and that's how the thing operates. So to start saying, let's do something about tax avoidance, you start to chew into a very, very fundamental part of how British capitalism actually operates. And so to raise the issue becomes something quite dangerous. It becomes something that all of a sudden you find that there are hugely important lobbies of people prepared to argue about why you shouldn't do any particular move on this, because you have to get into the detail, and therefore suddenly you run into X, Y or Z bank, or the corporation of the City of London, or the government ministers, or anybody else who fancies having a go saying why you shouldn't be doing this. So immediately you're brushing up against the structures of how capitalism is actually organised here, and that's why I think it is so hard, even though it looks so obvious, it is so hard to get any real movement in this one, because you're challenging something important. Which gets on to Jim's point, of course, which is why then austerity? Is it because Tories are stupid? No, I mean some of them are, but mostly, particularly the ones who end up being in charge, you have to guess aren't that stupid, really. At least you'd sort of hope so. Maybe not, maybe it'd be better if they were. But in any case, you have to assume it's not stupidity. I also don't think, on a similar bent, it's not just ideology. I mean, some of it's that. I mean, given half a chance, the people in government would be looking for a reason to try and privatise the NHS or whatever else. I mean, that's certainly part of how they would think about the world. And this is, as Rahm Emanuel, Obama's chief of staff said, you shouldn't let a good crisis go to waste. And certainly quite a degree of that taking place there, kind of opportunism, given their natural predilections. On the Tory and Lib Dem side, Vince Cable, Nick Clegg, all contributors to the Orange Book way back in 2005, calling for the privatisation of, lo and behold, the Royal Mail, the NHS, reducing taxes for the rich, all that sort of stuff. So they're kind of agreed in this one, but I don't think that's a driving force here. I think the driving force, you have to look back at what happened in the crash of 2008 to get a glimpse of what's taking place here. I've just read Damien McBride's memoirs of his time in government. Do people know the guy, Poison McBride?
Long train journey.
It was quite a long train journey. No, it's actually quite a good one. He writes very well, and some of the stuff is bits you remember and that sort of thing. But anyway, so Damien McBride recounts going to see Gordon Brown, who was Brown's press advisor for a number of years, just after the crash, Lehman Brothers, 5 years ago, around about 5 years ago today, in fact. Goes to see Brown. Brown sits him down and says, but look, basically it's incredibly serious. The world financial system's in meltdown. We're about this close to having to basically close all our bank branches and shut down all the ATMs, and nobody's going to have any money. If this happens, I'll have to call the army onto the streets to preserve order. And this is the discussion they have at that point in time. So this is quite serious on your list of things that would be quite serious that might happen as a result of the global financial meltdown. So they have to do something. Now, the something that they choose to do works in a very particular direction. It works in the direction of, as far as possible, keeping everything exactly the same as it was before the crash. And that's critical. Because you could have done, if you take Iceland, for example, you could just let a whole load of the more obnoxious parts of your banks fail, protect depositors and savers and ordinary people, let the gamblers and the spivs go to the wall. You can do this, right? But we don't do this. What we actually do is protect the gamblers and the spivs, and the rest of us then foot the bill for this. The total bill here is, on the IMF estimate, about £1.3 trillion. So that's the cost of this operation of keeping everything exactly the same. And you do keep everything exactly the same. You change ownership a bit, you move bits of the banks into the public sector, because you realise no one in the private sector is going to touch it without direct government support. But who do you put in charge of those banks? You don't clear out all the useless old guard who were there. You put them still in charge of the bloody thing through UK Financial Investments, was the body set up to do this, and you invite over some similarly culpable treasury mandarins to help run the thing. You leave everything exactly the same. You leave everything exactly the same, and you use huge amounts of public leverage and the government's own powers to borrow and raise taxes and impose austerity and the rest of it to do this. It's an enormously expensive operation, the end result of which is you end up with a financial system that looks exactly the same. And I think there's a key decision here for the British ruling class in general that's become worse and worse probably over the last 20, 30 years. That if you think about, basically this is a small island with not many people on it. Absurdly, it's about the 5th, 6th largest economy on the planet now. All the projections would be it's on the way out. But if you're concerned to maintain something like your position in a world of competing capitalist states, what particular advantages does British capitalism have? One, it has a very large military. We are the 4th largest military spenders in the world, and we are increasingly prepared, up until very recently, to use that military force. So that is something that you've got. And the other thing you've got is financial services. That London is massively and critically, systemically important to the global financial system. So you maintain those two things. Everything else can go hang, but you hold on to this. And that's the decision at the crash. And that's why you end up with this thing playing out. Not as let's reform the financial system, let's change how the thing operates, because that has consequences for the British ruling class as a whole and its position in the world. Instead, you get the imposition, or you get the bailouts and then the imposition of austerity. And behind this, of course, is a wider plan, no doubt, to reshape how the British state operates. The Tories, I think, are increasingly kind of blunt about. And that's why the thing plays out like this. This isn't stupidity. This isn't ideology. This is a calculation based on, I think, fairly rational collective appreciation of Britain's actual role in the world. It is crudely, well, it's banks and tax. That's what matters here, and everything else is, including all of us lot and the NHS and everything else, it doesn't matter nearly half so much. So, what then does this mean for the rest of us? Labour, left unity, and a couple of questions on that very quickly. Look, the one with, I mean, I agree basically with what Lindsey said about this, that it's like politics and comedy are very similar in that timing is everything. And left unity is a fine idea in the abstract. This is, of course, exactly what we need. It's just that the question raising it, let's imagine in 2016 or 2017, when there is a Labour government that is committed to austerity, that's facing serious splits in its own ranks, that's having to deliver what the Tories are delivering, and is confronted by a mass movement of people, some of whom support Labour, some of whom don't, saying don't do this. The question then of creating an alternative and posing that seriously, and talking seriously about breaks in the Labour Party, so MPs leaving the Labour Party, never mind individual members and all the rest of it, unions deciding not to back the Labour Party, that becomes a serious proposition for an alternative to Labour. Unfortunately, scraping together the bits and pieces of the far left right now, ahead of that prospect, isn't such a serious proposition. And I do, you know, I mean, having gone through any number of electoral campaigns, there's a kind of naivety about this. The sheer scale of what you have to do to get a halfway decent vote. It is the hardest campaign you will ever run. It is hard work like you wouldn't believe. You need organisation, you need numbers of people. You need to knock on every door. You need to keep doing this. You need all these things, the political discipline necessary to hold that together. It's incredibly difficult, which is where I slightly disagree with Neil. I don't think you just dismiss all this. You know, it is a peak of organisation for what you're doing on the left to even deliver 20% of the vote, let alone to win an election. It's very hard to do all this, and I don't think left unity at the moment has that appreciation. If we want to get to the point where, in all seriousness, we can talk about splitting the Labour Party to its left, and that's the kind of perspective we have to be talking about here, and reshaping the left around that, a left that opposes austerity, talks about alternatives to austerity and to war. If we're serious about that, we have to build a mass movement now that's capable of applying that pressure to the Labour Party out of office and potentially inside of office as well. That's what creates the conditions where something like left unity, or whatever we want to call it, becomes a plausible mass party rather than a few of us thinking it's a good idea. Okay.